so glad you could come back. I'm Mary Davidson, and it's our community. We have the most interesting guest today. Actually, I have to admit, he's been a friend of mine for a very long time, and his name is Bruce Mathews. And Bruce is a professional photographer, but you've kind of forgotten that that's what you really do.
That's what, in my real life.
Yes. But what he really does, and has done for an awful long time, is to be a trustee of the historic Elmwood Cemetery. It's taken up a lot of your life, I realize, because he has written the most wonderful book, and it's called Elmwood Cemetery, The Story of Kansas City. That's the cover of the book, and those are all the wonderful mausoleums that are out there on the side of that hill.
Right.
Beautiful place. In your book, you say, cemeteries everywhere are a glimpse into the history of their communities. They represent the fabric that has been woven through the generations.
That is especially true in Elmwood's case. I like to tell people that Elmwood is the most historic site in Kansas City, and they're taken aback sometimes, and I say, well, if you take the collective lives of the people that are buried there and the impact that they had on Kansas City and their descendants, it truly is one of the most historic sites in Kansas City.
Well, and those collective lives number about 36,000.
36,000.
Yes, on 43 acres. That's a big place.
It is.
But where is it? Tell them, because I know there are people out there that would really like to go.
Elmwood Cemetery, the physical address is 4900 East Truman Road. It is basically at the northwest corner of Truman Road and Van Brunt, just about 1.5 miles east of downtown Kansas City.
It's worth the trip out there, and they're nice folks in there. They don't say much.
And they've got great stories to tell.
They have
too.
great stories to tell, and they are indeed the fabric, and they have indeed been woven through the generations.
Right.
You have a section. I have to tell you, I have taken license and made executive decisions here and picked what interested me to talk about.
Sounds great.
And one of the sections you call the firsts.
Right.
And James Hyatt McGee is one of the firsts.
He was the first white settler in Kansas City. Came here in about 1827, before Kansas City even existed as it did. And the cemetery was founded in 1872, but his gravestone indicates that he died in 1840. Well, what happened was he was buried on his family farm where Bartle Hall sits today. And so as the city grew, his son Elijah, who became one of 12 mayors who are buried in Kansas City, moved the family to, some of the family went to Union Cemetery, but most of them came to Elmwood. And so his is the oldest grave in the cemetery.
And every time you drive down McGee Street, you can think about him.
That's right.
A once forgotten soul is Helena Baum.
Helena Baum is the oldest Jewish gravestone in Kansas City. You can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the congregation B'nai Yehuda was formed in about 1866, and they purchased about 1/8 of an acre at 18th and Lydia, and there were 37
souls,
members of the church who were buried there, including Helena. I believe Helena was 22 years old, and she was killed in a train wreck. In 1872, and in 1872, when Elmwood opened, the congregation purchased the southwest 2 acres of Elmwood Cemetery, and all those 37 people were then moved over to Elmwood Cemetery, including Helena.
Now, she died in 1866. She was
That's correct.
She was in a train wreck.
Right.
She was so young. But when you talk about Elmwood, you think of a white Caucasian cemetery. That's not exactly true.
No.
There are African Americans in Elmwood Cemetery, which, they had cemeteries for African Americans, but Elmwood has some very distinguished African American clients.
Residents.
Residents, yes.
However you want to say it.
Yes.
Yes, and in no way, Kansas City historically had been a very segregated city, but that was not the case at Elmwood. There is no African American section to Elmwood at all. African Americans are buried throughout the cemetery. The one that I like the story of the most is William F. Davis. He was the first African-American police officer in Kansas City, and he joined the force in 1874.
Do you think it was difficult for him to join the force? Did they make it difficult for him to do that, being an African-American, or did they just take him because he was good?
He certainly paved the way for other African-Americans, because there are other African-American police officers buried in Elmwood that came after him. Yeah. The thing that amazes me, that when you look at this was just 9 years after the Civil War, and that's quite an amazing accomplishment, I think.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not only, it's odd because those things weren't happening quite that soon after the Civil War. William F. Davis must have been quite a guy.
He was. There's another one, Buck Thompson, who is well respected and on the police force, and he came shortly thereafter, and he was,
Did both of those men have a long tenure on the police force? Do you know?
William F. Yes, both of them. I think Davis was, he served for, I think, 12 years, something like that. And Buck Thompson was on even longer than that.
Well, and I think that's an important point to make. They didn't take them just to be taking them. They served well.
That's correct.
Well, two of my favorites are Americus McKim and James Whitfield.
Right. There was a three-member ownership of the first Major League Baseball team in Kansas City. Americus McKim, and this was the Kansas City Cowboys, and the year was 1886. They were a member of the National League because the American League didn't even exist yet. And Americus McKim died as a pauper. He was broke, and actually was in an unmarked grave for well over 100 years.
In Elmwood?
In Elmwood, in an unmarked grave, until a group called SABRE found out about him. SABRE is the Society of American Baseball Researchers. And this is kind of the statistical nuts for baseball. And they found out about Americus McKim and also James Whitfield. James Whitfield was the sporting editor for the Kansas City Star, and went on to become president of the Western League, but he was also in that 1886 was part of with Joseph Heim as well, who was
so they all knew each other.
They knew each other, yes. Yeah, and they got the first franchise, so they predate Charlie Finley and Ewing Kauffman and all our baseball heritage. They were a wild bunch too.
How did you, as a matter of interest, when the SABRE organization found out that Americus McKim was there, how did you find him?
Oh,
I want to talk about the records. The
thing about Elmwood is that today it is totally dependent on volunteers and donations for its upkeep. Any perpetual funds that might have been established have long been eaten away. The families, most of the families have moved away, and so it's just been taken over.
Well, and old families die out.
Huh?
Old families die out. They're just gone. Yeah.
They do. Yeah. And I hate to see that some of this heritage would be lost, you know, and so I think that's why it's important to perpetuate the life stories of the people that are buried there.
But you had a record of his burial in the files.
Elmwood has always had great records. There's little 3.5 by 5 interment cards on everybody, and then each family lot has a map, and so you can tell where, within inches, each person is buried, whether they have a marker or not. And so it's one of the things we've also done recently is we've taken all those fragile and brittle paper cards and everything, and we have scanned them all, so we have them all digitized now too.
Well, and if some of the families, I have a plot out there, I own all the graves, and I have a plot at Elmwood, and I can look at the records and see if there's a place for me to be planted, should I desire to do so.
Planted,
yes.
That's a good one.
But the point is that the records are there.
The records are there.
And if any of you have relatives at Elmwood, you know, there's somebody in the office from time to time, and the volunteers are glad to look for you, and you can go look for yourself.
Absolutely, help people.
Yeah. The first chief of police is also there.
First chief of police was Thomas Spears.
Thomas Spears.
And this was also in 1870.
I was checking to see if you remembered.
This was also in 1874. And there's an interesting picture of Tom Spears and his police force in 1886, and they're standing there with a Gatling gun. And I thought, that was their day crowd control.
That's right.
Yeah. But yeah, there are over 50 policemen and firemen, including Francis Foster, who was the first chief of the fire department, and then Tom Spears, who was the first chief of police. Are these people,
or do you know, were these people native Kansas Cityans? Were they, if they weren't?
Most of them settled here. You know, Kansas City was founded in 1850, and most of these people had come here from Kentucky, Virginia, and other points east, and settled here. So that's the one thing that they have virtually in common, that they settled here. There you go.
I have to show this. This is the Gatling gun and the police force with Chief Spears. Aren't they a wonderful looking lot?
I like their hats.
I love them. I just love them. I thought
that was the other thing that I had. The book, I'm not technically the author of that, but I think I'm the instigator of the book. What we were blessed with is you wrote one of the chapters in conjunction with Judge Sachs on the Jewish section of the cemetery. Crosby Kemper wrote a chapter on the politicians. Barnett Hellsberg wrote a chapter on the merchants, and I think there are a total of about 25 authors in the book. And that's great to see people perpetuate the life stories of the people that gave us the Kansas City spirit. I think our Kansas City spirit has been taking a beating in the last few years.
I think so too,
and so
I think things like
maybe
this,
we can learn from people like this.
I think so too, and I know that the World War I Museum and the Star and everybody was so kind to give you photographs.
Right.
Other than the beautiful ones that you took, the old ones came from
and the families. Yeah. The book actually started about 5 years ago. I began building a family history file for all 36,000 people that are buried in the cemetery, and it's kind of taken on a life of its own now. We have it posted on our website, so somebody that's doing genealogical research, they can look at the website. And I go home and every day there's maybe a half a dozen emails from people either asking me questions about their family that are buried there, or sending photographs and stories about their loved ones who are buried there. So what a great feeling it is.
Well, when you go, you'll have to have one of those mausoleums, because they'll chuck all this stuff in that you've been collecting. Well, 36,000 people is a lot to catalog. And
when I go out to speak about Elmwood, I will, other than touching on the historic aspect of the cemetery, I'll ask people, how many of you in your group have family buried in Elmwood? Maybe 10% of the audience will raise their hand. So the other 90%, I say to them, you do have people buried in Elmwood, you just don't know it yet.
That's right, that's right. I asked you who you thought the most famous person buried in Elmwood was, and you chose?
Well, probably Jacob Luce.
Yes.
We know Jacob Luce for the park that bears his name just south of the plaza.
He is such a distinguished looking man.
It is, that his wife donated to the city in his honor after he died. I don't think people know that much about how he made his money. He founded what was then the Luce Wiles Biscuit Company. And so...
and those were cookies.
Those were cookies and biscuits and crackers.
Yeah.
But his nickname for his wife, Ella, was Sunshine. So that became Sunshine Biscuits. So to Jacob Luce, we owe the crispy cracker and the Hydrox cookie and a lot of other treats like this.
And he and Ella have a beautiful mausoleum out there.
They do. They have a beautiful mausoleum. And actually their home still exists and has been lovingly restored and is available now for special events. Wedding receptions and stuff like that. So it's a great treasure in its own right for the city.
Do you have a favorite story about one of the residents?
Yes. One of them is in the book, one of the chapters is called Once Forgotten Souls. And there is a lady in the cemetery who was just buried a few years ago, but she died in 1983, and her name was Bernice Hickman. And the cemetery got a call from Dan Verbeck, who used to be on KMBZ, now does some programming on KCUR, and asked if we would donate a plot for Bernice. And when he told us Bernice's story, we said, of course we would. It seems like in mid-1980s, a young rookie police officer took a call from a family that was moving into a house in Midtown. And the family frantically said, "You've got to come here real quick. There's a dead body in this house." So this rookie police officer shows up, and it was Bernice's ashes. It was her urn. So the police department called the family that moved out of the house and said, "You have to come and pick up this urn." And I swear this was the story they were given. "We didn't like her when she was alive. You can keep her." So for over 20 years, her ashes sat in the police property room.
Oh, golly.
So we had a funeral for Bernice. Everybody deserves a proper funeral. And so the police officer who took the call was there. He's now a detective on the force. The police chaplain conducted the service. We marched her down to her new gravesite, and Bernice had a
right, proper burial.
She did.
She did indeed. I want to talk about one of my favorites, Annie Chambers.
Annie Chambers. Annie has if you see a picture of Annie, Annie was very tall. She was very large. And she was well over 6 feet tall. And you see some of the old pictures of her, and she looks like she could have been a librarian.
She looks like, there is a picture by James McNeill Whistler that he did of his mother. And that looks like Annie Chambers. She had little glasses, and a little hat, very properly dressed. But Annie Chambers, in case you don't know, was a madam.
Yes. And she had a very fitting maiden name. Her maiden name was Lovell, Loveall. And I think, what a great name for a madam. But Annie was a good case that it is never too late for redemption. At the age of 92, she gave her home and all her money to found what became the City Union Mission.
Well, I don't know. Annie had a hard life, and she needed to make a living, and she did that in the only way she knew.
That's right.
How about Andrew Watson Armour? They have a chapel out there.
Well, the Armour
family.
The Armour family is an interesting story. They of course founded what became the Armour Meatpacking Company in Kansas City and Chicago. Some family settled in both cities and everything. In the middle of the cemetery is a beautiful old chapel, and it is the Armour Memorial Chapel, and it was built in 1902 by the wife of Kirkland Brooks Armour, who, along with his other family members, founded the Armour Meatpacking Company, and that chapel is just beautiful.
It's beautiful. And if you go out to the cemetery, try to go maybe on a Sunday. The chapel is usually open.
Yes, and we still have we have special events in there, and an occasional wedding even in there.
So it's beautiful.
Yeah,
it's absolutely beautiful. Another very distinguished resident is Brigadier General Harold L. Oppenheimer.
He is.
And his grave, I think, is befitting a brigadier general. And he died in 1985, but he was quite a guy.
The general.
Yes.
I like to talk about him because he is there are 1,500 veterans that are buried in Elmwood, anywhere from the War of 1812, where James McGee served up until Vietnam. And General Oppenheimer is the only veteran to have served in 3 wars that is buried in Elmwood. And he started out in the Marine Corps in World War II, then he served in Korea, and then was called up for active duty again in Vietnam. So he
served his country.
He served his country.
He did indeed.
Yeah.
There's some women that I would like to discuss as well. And a woman by the name of Nancy Tyler Holmes. Lovely, beautiful lady. But she is related to somebody that we all know.
Well, actually, she's related to 2 presidents. She was Nancy Tyler Holmes was a cousin of President John Tyler, and then she is the great-grandmother
of Tippecanoe and Tyler, too.
Yes, yeah. She is the great-grandmother of President Truman from right here in Independence. Matter of fact, one of the chapters in the book I called Legacies, and I photographed descendants holding photographs of their ancestor, and then had them write about that person's legacy. So Clifton Truman Daniel is seen in the book holding a photograph of his great-great-great-grandmother, and he, of course, is the grandson of President Truman.
It's wonderful to live in a community where you can hold a picture of your great-great-great-grandmother.
Yes.
How about Frances Swope Hyde?
Frances Swope Hyde. Actually, the designer of the book, D.J. Hyde Matheny, is the granddaughter of Frances Swope Hyde. Frances Swope Hyde was the niece of Colonel Thomas Swope,
and the wife of
Dr. Bennett Clark Hyde. This was the Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil trial, and O.J. Simpson all rolled into one in the early 19-teens.
Well, and there's a new book out about the trial that, if you haven't read, Murder on Pleasant Street, Giles Fowler wrote, and it's just a wonderful book about the Swope trial and Dr. Hyde being tried 3 times.
3 times.
Because they didn't have DNA, they didn't have anything. But Frances is buried out there.
Frances is buried. They actually divorced after the trials.
But she waited till after all 3 trials.
Absolutely.
She did not leave him.
And he is buried in Lexington, and she is buried in Elmwood along with a child that they had during the trial and who lived.
She was expecting that child during the trial, and it was such a trauma that she lost that baby. Right. So baby Hyde is buried in Elmwood along with his mother. So.
Yes.
But if you haven't read Murder on Pleasant Street, go do it. It's very interesting. Mary McAfee Atkins. We need to talk about her.
Again, Mary Atkins kind of looks like Nancy Tyler Holmes. Her photograph. She was very much a recluse later on in life, but her husband died and left her $250,000, and she invested very wisely. And when she died, her will left $350,000 to match a grant from William Rockhill Nelson, and so those 2 names are certainly known today for the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas
Now, how
City.
many naming opportunities do you think there are today on such a project as the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art for $350,000?
Right. Yes.
But when she gave that money, that was a lot of money.
Yes,
it was
a lot of money.
Yeah.
I think she had invested, I think she had over $1 million when she died.
Well, and as I recall, after the money was given, it was a while before the museum was built.
It was
20
a number of years.
Something like that. 20, 30 years.
She had stipulated it'd go to the arts, and she actually gave her gift before William Rockhill Nelson gave his.
Yes.
They were combined to bless Kansas City with the world-class art museum that we have today.
Isn't it interesting that walking through this cemetery, and I know that you always say if you want to relax and I don't know, feel good, you walk through that cemetery. First of all, it's beautiful. But isn't it interesting that the history of a city can be so carefully woven into the fabric through the people who are buried in that cemetery?
Right. And you talked about the peaceful aspect of the cemetery. That was not by accident. The cemetery was designed by George Kessler, who designed all the parks and boulevard
and
system.
The pocket parks. He also did those.
And the parks, and he also designed. His connection with August Meyer, who is buried in Elmwood. August Meyer was the first president of the Park Board in Kansas City and hired George Kessler to design the parks and boulevard system. August Meyer was also a president of the Elmwood Cemetery Society and hired George Kessler to design Elmwood. And then he also hired George Kessler to design the grounds of his home. At the time it was called Marburg, and today we know it as Vanderslice Hall now at the Kansas City Art Institute. But the cemeteries like this from the 1860s, 1870s were the forerunners for our parks. People would come, parades would stop and start, and
well, every year you have a picnic at Elmwood Cemetery, and it's loads of fun. I have been there, and it's just wonderful.
We've been blessed the last couple of years to by Adele Hall and Shirley Hillsberg and Mary Hunkler and Shawsey Branton, Anita Gorman, Barb Unell, and Barbara Potts have sponsored the annual Elmwood picnic, and I think it was just a few weeks ago, and we had almost 300 people there at the picnic in the cemetery.
Fine ladies all, and thank them for being interested in that wonderful cause. There's another person, though, that I want to get to before we... Milton Feld.
Milton Feld, of course, we know Milton Feld
Feld Chevrolet. Yeah,
these two Miltons were cousins, as I understand it.
But this is not the same one.
No.
This
Milton Feld that's buried in Elmwood managed the Newman Theater in Kansas City. And he was approached by a struggling young film animator to produce a series of shorts to run between the full-length feature films.
Oh, I remember those.
He
I shouldn't say that, though, should I?
What's that?
I remember those shorts, but I shouldn't say
They were called Newman Laugh-O-Grams, and that was Walt Disney's first start in animated films.
Isn't that interesting? I just think it's so interesting. You know, as you walk through the cemetery, you see all kinds of symbols and signs and things on the... But angels are in a preponderance in the iconography of the cemetery. And why angels? What? They're beautiful. They're all
guarding, watching guard over our protector. There's a lot of symbolism, and you'll also see a number of look like tree stumps with broken branches and stuff, and all that. Maybe a fern growing up out of the bottom of it, and all of that means something. Like a life cut short when you see a branch hanging down, and ones I typically like are a rose carved into it.
And that means?
Everlasting love, beauty, and just the symbolism that you might think. And the chapter in the book goes into great detail about that, and I think that's...
Well, there are many chapters in this book that I would... all the bookstores are carrying it, and if you haven't gotten it, I just think that you will enjoy it mightily, because in it live the people who have really meant something to our whole community. So I have to read you, my grandparents are out there, and my picture was taken with them, and I want to read you what I wrote. I said, "Every man is a quotation from all of his ancestors." Ralph Waldo Emerson said it first. And I said the Davidson family was one of talent and creativity, whether it was the eloquence of their speaking, the power of the written word, the musical abilities of Lizzie's legacy, or the good name that I have cherished these many years. I am proud to be their granddaughter and to be their quotation. And I think all of us who had any part in this book and who have anyone at Elmwood Cemetery are also very proud to be the quotations of our forebears. What a wonderful job you have done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce Mathews. Thanks. And thank all of you. You know, it's our community. And isn't it interesting? It's wonderful to live here. I'm always so pleased to say it's my community, as I know you are to say it's yours. Come again soon. I'll be looking for you.